thousands of weapons at each other with very little warning time, and when both sides fear a first strike from the other. Those things simply don't go together. So we've got to change the psychology. We've got to back off some of the concepts we had during the Cold War, and we've got to understand that the threat has changed.
That America's security could depend on Russia's early warning or command and control systems working perfectly 365 days a year is an absurd situation in today's security environment. Mistakes can and do happen, including in the United States military, where there is evidence that attention to nuclear weapons security has diminished. In August 2007, an Air Force B-52 was mistakenly loaded with 6 nuclear missiles and flown from North Dakota to Louisiana across America's heartland. No one knew where the weapons were for 36 hours. In fact, no one even knew they were missing. We've also learned that nuclear bomb fuse assemblies were mistakenly shipped to Taiwan instead of helicopter batteries. Security lapses so serious that the Secretary of Defense fired both the civilian head of the Air Force and the general serving as Chief of Staff.
The fact that we could put nuclear-armed missiles on an airplane and fly them for hours without anybody realizing what was happening, I think is a reflection of 2 factors. First of all, that we still have lots of nuclear weapons in our inventory. But secondly, our military today rightly doesn't believe the nuclear weapons are key to maintaining the security. And therefore, they don't have the same level of attention, high-level oversight that they had at one time. In a way, this is the most dangerous of all worlds, where you still have all these nuclear weapons, but you're not paying enough attention to them. At least during the Cold War, when we had these huge nuclear arsenals, they were given very serious attention. I cannot imagine an incident like that, for example, having happened during the Cold War.
Everybody who has technology knows that technology can go wrong. We should take that kind of scenario out of the equation. We should do everything we can to reduce the chances of an accident. And that is particularly true in an age of terror. And it is particularly true in an age where you have cyber capabilities and it is possible to simulate a nuclear attack that might be picked up by warning systems.
There are a number of other steps that we need to take to reduce nuclear dangers in the near term.
Nuclear weapons that are so-called tactical weapons. They're smaller, they're more mobile. They're also just the kind of a weapon that would be a handy thing for a terrorist to get a hold of. So one of the steps that we propose is, let's get hold of all these weapons and let's get rid of them right now.
Another step that can be taken is to eliminate sources of highly enriched uranium, for example, that could be bought or stolen by a terror group. There are research reactors located around the world that use highly enriched uranium, and that's not necessary.
And as energy prices continue to rise, harnessing the power of the atom is seen as a clean source of electricity.
In order to prevent the carbon from being spewed into the atmosphere, which could precipitate the global warming, more and more nations are turning to nuclear reactors, which is a perfectly reasonable action for them to take. But the danger of that is that in generating the fuel for the nuclear reactors, the country has gone through a process which could, if continued for another few cycles, would lead to the same kind of uranium that could be used for a nuclear bomb. The solution to the problem is known. It is to allow countries to have nuclear reactors, which deals with the environmental problem, but under the conditions in which they do not have control of the fuel cycle. They do not process the fuel.
Nuclear power does furnish a lot of hope for mankind, but only if it's safe and only if it's secure. We're also working hard to try to set up the concept of a fuel bank. Based on Warren Buffett's generosity, I was able to go over to Vienna and pledge $50 million to the International Atomic Energy Agency if they raised $100 million additional to set up a last resort fuel supply so that we can say to countries around the globe, you don't have to have your own enrichment.
Over the long term, we need to be heading towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And over the short term, we need to be taking the steps to reduce the danger that the nuclear weapons we already have could be used. This is such an important problem in my mind that it dwarfs all other considerations. And I have myself decided to devote the balance of my career to working to achieve that goal.
I believe that we need a vision. We need a vision of a world without nuclear weapons. It's going to take a long time to get there. There are all sorts of steps that we have to take to be able to even move toward that vision, where we make nuclear weapons less relevant, where we prevent their proliferation, and where we eventually end them as a threat to the world. That vision is essential to build the cooperation we need from countries around the globe in terms of taking the steps we need to prevent a nuclear nightmare. So the vision and the steps, in my view, go together.
We have always insisted on saying, let us test each proposition and see how it actually works and see whether it can be made to work. And we have not come to a point yet where one would say it's unworkable. And that I consider great progress.
These ideas are not abstract concepts. They have been proven to work in the real world. In the early 1990s, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan agreed to remove all nuclear weapons from their territories. This joint effort was made possible through a cooperative program started by Republican Senator Richard Lugar and Democratic Senator Sam Nunn. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States, Russia, and the former Soviet Union, working together, have deactivated or destroyed over 7,000 nuclear warheads, as well as hundreds of missiles, launchers, bombers, submarines, test tunnels, and other tools of nuclear war.
Before I became secretary, I had worked with Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar to craft the Nunn-Lugar program, because I believed, as they believed, that the so-called loose nukes problem was the gravest security danger we faced. A few years later, I became the Secretary of Defense. I helped then negotiate with Russia and Ukraine what was called the Trilateral Agreement, by which Ukraine agreed to give up its thousands of nuclear weapons that it had inherited when the Cold War was over. And so with the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, I visited the primary site where the dismantlement was going on 4 different times. The first time we oversaw the removal of the warhead from the missile. The second time we oversaw the removal of the missiles from the silos. The third time I went along with the Ukrainian and the Russian defense minister, and we blew up a silo.
The following spring, Secretary Perry and the commanders of those missile silos planted sunflowers on the site, turning sources of death and destruction to fields of peace, hope, and livelihood for the citizens of Ukraine. And much of what was accomplished in those years continues to pay dividends today.
Well, let me give you one example. We were able to make a deal in the 1990s to say to them, okay, you've got a value in your highly enriched uranium that's in the weapons that are aimed at the United States. We will work with you to take that highly enriched uranium and let Russia process it. Take your weapon apart, let Russia process the highly enriched uranium into low enriched uranium, which can be burned in power plants, and we will buy it. If you look at electricity in this country, 19% of it comes from nuclear power. We are buying about half of the material we use in our nuclear power plants from the highly enriched uranium that has been blended down from those weapons. So mathematically, if you look at light bulbs in this country or any other form of electricity, 1 out of 10 light bulbs is coming from weapons that were aimed at us.